everyone! Welcome to the first devlog for my game, Tales, a game about exploring, collecting, and selling houseplants. I've been developing it in my spare time for the past year using the Godot game engine. Today, I'm excited to finally share with you how it all began and what the development process has been like so far. So I hope you enjoy this deep dive into Tales. Every game starts with an idea, and it's probably no surprise that I got mine from my houseplants. When I first got into this hobby, I was actually amazed by how resilient they can be. Some can grow without soil, they can regrow from almost nothing, and best of all, they can clone themselves. Many houseplants can reproduce without seeds, and there are many different propagation techniques available. But what fascinated me most is how some can push out these tiny baby versions of themselves. You can see this here with my spider plant, and also this money plant, which has now had so many babies I don't know what to do with them. Trying to grow my collection through propagation was surprisingly addictive, and that's what sparked the idea for my game. I had this clear vision for a grid-based system where plants naturally multiply across tiles. But to make it into a full game, there has to be some sort of other elements to the gameplay too. I kinda wanted to do something similar to the game Slime Rancher, except with plants instead of slimes. So my plan for the gameplay loop was something like this. Explore to find new plants, clone them, sell them, upgrade your gear, and then the cycle continues in a positive feedback loop. I still wasn't sure of all the details, like how the selling mechanic could work and how the story should go, but I felt like I had enough ideas to get started in the meantime. And with that in mind, I began drawing the first visuals for the game. At first, I wasn't sure what art style to go with. I tried minimalistic pixel art without outlines, and even considered using 3D to get some nice shadows. But between struggling with my early attempts and being really inspired by other artists, I eventually landed on this more outlined style. It still looked a bit silly, but I was happy with the direction it was going, and so I decided to move on for now. My next priority was to make interacting with the plants feel as satisfying as possible, and that included making the plants gently bounce as you walk through them. But as is often the case with game development, my first attempt achieved the exact opposite of what I was going for. Eventually though, I fixed it by ticking this one checkbox, and finally it was starting to look right. I also had a specific vision for how picking the plants would go. The sprite would stretch slightly, a satisfying pop sound would play, and as it rises up you'd be able to see the roots. These little touches, along with a wind sway effect and an outline shader, meant I had to create quite a few custom shaders, but I think the result was worth the effort. Next, I needed to make sure the plants were actually collected, instead of just vanishing into thin air, and for that, I needed an inventory system. Taking inspiration from Slime Rancher again, I decided to keep things simple and have a hotbar only. Players could start with just a few slots and maybe unlock more over time. I kind of dreaded adding the hotbar because in my previous game, I redid the UI over and over trying to improve its design. So to avoid the same pains, I tried to think about it a bit more carefully before diving into the implementation. These are the guidelines I came up with. I guess something to point out is that I wanted to avoid using brown tones if possible, mostly because I'm trying to distinguish this game from the plethora of farming sims already out there. So I decided to go with a white theme, which eventually evolved into this. The next thing I wanted to work on was a greenhouse. The greenhouse could be a designated space where the plants could multiply. Otherwise, the entire world could become completely overrun. My first attempts at drawing the greenhouse were not great, but eventually I decided to abandon the tile-based approach and just draw the building as one large sprite. I actually modeled a rough version in Blender to use as a reference. Probably won't be doing this again as it took a long time, but it was pretty helpful when I was starting out. While all that was happening, I also began setting up a new scene for the interior of the greenhouse, where the plant propagation would actually happen. But having two separate scenes introduced a new challenge. The player's inventory kept resetting when switching between them. And that's because switching scenes in Godot deletes everything in the current one. Luckily, Godot has a built-in solution for this: autoloads. After I made a new autoload to store the game's data, I was able to save and load the hotbar contents from it. Now that it's possible to bring plants into the greenhouse, I was keen to start making them spread over time. But not before getting quite sidetracked by adding a bed. Just like in Stardew Valley, sleeping in bed will skip to the next day. In saying that though, I don't plan to have a mandatory 2 AM bedtime, and sleeping will probably just be optional. With that now out of my system, I could finally work on the plant cloning mechanic. The idea was simple. Once every 24 hours, all fully grown plants check for empty tiles next to them. And if there's space, it might spawn a baby plant. Each plant has 3 growth stages, so it takes around 4 days to produce a full clone. I'm not sure if this will feel too slow or too fast when in-game, but I can always tweak the growth speed later if needed. And that pretty much wraps up the second month of development. The next month, I couldn't resist spending some time improving the visuals. First up was the grass. I added this hand-drawn texture to the grass tiles, and it instantly made the world feel so much more alive. I actually already made a video diving into the technical side of how I did this, so feel free to check that out if you're curious. I also updated the player sprite, added some boundary cliffs, and most importantly, made some trees. The player is going to be spending a lot of time exploring the jungle to find plants, so they're going to be seeing a lot of trees. This meant I really wanted to get them looking good, but I really struggled with drawing them. It didn't help that I didn't have my iPad or a drawing tablet at the time, so I was stuck drawing every single leaf with a mouse. I went through so many iterations, looking at different tutorials and reference photos each time. But finally, I somehow managed to scrap together this one, and I was pretty happy with it. Weirdly enough, after all this, I actually now prefer using a mouse to draw pixel art. Being able to flip between drawing and testing is super convenient, and all the keyboard shortcuts really speed things up too. Anyway, next I created a new scene and wrote some code to randomly spawn in the trees. One of my favourite tricks is using Perlin noise to generate these natural looking clusters. I also wrote some code to spawn in these small patches of more valuable plants that the player can collect. My plan was to have the player explore a network of forest areas, each connected by entry and exit points. The deeper you go, the better plants you'll find. But I was having a lot of difficulty getting the network to generate how I wanted, and even worse, exploring it didn't feel very fun. I found myself just racing to find the exits instead of looking for plants, like I had originally envisioned. This whole exploration system will definitely need a rework at some point. But I was feeling a bit down about it, so I decided to tackle some other things in the meantime. So next I moved on to creating the player's home. As much as I personally wouldn't mind sleeping in a greenhouse, it probably makes more sense to give the player a designated home for that. This was my first design, and initially I was quite happy with it. But as I started thinking more and more about the overall setting of the game, I thought a simpler, rustic cottage would fit better with the vibe I'm going for. And as for the interior, I kept it pretty simple with just a bed and a dresser for now. By the way, I also updated it so that the plants can spread outside of the greenhouse, but only if they're on soil. Next, it was time to fix some bugs. There was this strange issue where every now and then, plants would become really bouncy. Sometimes they got so bouncy that they flew off the screen entirely, only to slowly spiral back down in a rather mesmerizing fashion. I thought it was happening randomly, but eventually I realized it was actually caused by something quite unexpected: clicking outside the game window. The plant bounce is controlled by a damped sine wave in a shader, with elapsed time along the x-axis. Since large values were being generated, they must have been coming from here instead of here. But in order for that to be possible, the elapsed time must somehow be negative. Long story short, the built-in shader time seemed to be giving some funky values because I managed to fix this bug by ditching that completely and passing in the time manually from the CPU instead. Unfortunately, this then caused major performance issues, but luckily after a bit of a refactor, it all worked out in the end. So to recap, The game now has a rudimentary way to collect plants, and they can be brought back to the home area or greenhouse to be cloned. But there was still one big piece missing. There was no way to sell them. So I thought it would be fun to introduce a bit of shop management into the game. I started by creating a new interior scene. The idea is that you begin with a small shop containing a few empty plots I'm calling plant displays. To sell a plant, you simply place it on a display, and sometime later, a customer will come and buy it. The customers aren't implemented yet, but my plan is to eventually have NPCs wandering around the shop. However, I don't want players to feel like they have to babysit the shop. Standing at a register isn't exactly exciting gameplay, so instead, customers will just leave money on the counter, and players can collect it whenever they return from their adventures. The only thing you really need to worry about is keeping the shop fully stocked with plants. Because space is limited, there's also a bit of strategy involved in deciding which plants to sell. And to simulate customer demand and to encourage variety, I added a cap on how many of each plant type can be sold per day. I also added functionality to rearrange the plant displays, buy more of them, and upgrade them into tables. Why tables? Well, while I was implementing the shop, I came up with an idea for a shop rating system. Tables, for example, will increase the decor stat of your shop, which boosts your overall rating. A higher rating means more customers and thus more sales each day. The other stats that influence the rating are variety and stock, meaning the player should aim to have a variety of plants and they should avoid having empty plots. I'm so excited about how this whole shop rating system came together. It will definitely need a bit more balancing, but I hope it adds an interesting bit of strategy. No farming sim is complete without a watering can, so that's what I added next. Firstly, I updated the leftmost hotbar slot to be a dedicated tool slot. Right now there are just two tools, the default hand and the watering can, which you can toggle between using the tab key. Instead of having to click each tile to water individually, I wanted to try something a little different. So I configured this particle stream that can be toggled on and off by clicking, and you can simply hover over the areas you want to water. These wet patches form on the ground, and a fun side effect is that you can make little drawings with them. Of course, watering wouldn't add much if it didn't affect plant growth, so I updated the plants to only grow if they've been watered within the last 24 hours. I keep track of the time last saved in each plant so that when it gets unloaded and loaded again, the game can simulate the growth that should have happened in that time. So no matter what's loaded or where you are, it feels like the plants grow at a consistent rate. Since watering is critical for plant growth, there also needed to be a clear indication when a plant is thirsty. At first, I experimented with dulling the colours and making them feel stiffer, but the effect was hard to distinguish between plants. So I scrapped that and added these much more obvious water indicators instead. Over the months, I have slowly been adding more plant species to the game, so here's a quick overview of all the different types so far. In the future, I'd like to add more flowers and succulents, and maybe come up with a few mythical varieties. If you have any favourite plants, I'd also love to hear your suggestions. I knew I wanted the first section of wilderness to be a rainforest, but right now it didn't look like one at all. So I added a bunch of new tropical foliage, along with a special windy effect for them. It was getting a bit hard to tell which plants are worth picking and which ones aren't though, so to help make it super obvious, I also added this shine effect. I also spent some time this month on trying to make the procedural rainforest generation more interesting by adding creeks. Some of you might recognize this water shader from my previous project, which I pretty much just copied and pasted over. I love how these creeks turned out, and I have some exciting ideas for them down the line, but unfortunately I still didn't love the procedural network idea as a whole. Anyway, now I want to talk about the shop again. At this point the interior was mostly there, but it had no exterior. The question was, where do I put the shop so that NPCs can walk in and out? It didn't really make sense to put it in the player's backyard, and it didn't make sense to put it in the forest either. So that's when I realized I might have to create a town of some sort. Well, maybe an entire town was a bit too ambitious, so perhaps just a street would do. Here's my initial design for the shop. but I'll probably revisit it later to add more signs and things. To the south of the street, I plan to add a community garden. And to the north, there's a river, a campsite, and then this path that leads to the wilderness. I was hesitant to add a town at first, but I think this small layout is manageable, and I'm excited to add more kinds of shops down the line. Now it's time for one of my absolute favourite features in video games. The character customization system will heavily overlap with generating NPCs, so my plan was to knock out both these features at once. First, I separated the player sprite into multiple layers. This includes the skin, clothes, eyes and hair, with animations for each. Then I had heaps of fun coming up with different designs. I especially love these different eye options. They add so much character. I also want to mention that for the long hair, I separated it further into a front layer and a back layer. With several options for the front and several options for the back, this results in a huge number of possible hairstyles without too much effort on my part. Next, it was time to tie it all together in a user interface, which again took me a while to settle on this design. Now that the character customization was ready, all the sprites and data structures I just made can be used to make the NPCs. First, I got them spawning in random spots, and then I added some pathfinding. It was very easy to do this thanks to Godot's A-star pathfinding functionality. The NPCs now also spawn in the interior of the shop, just before they are about to order something. It still looks a bit jank when the plant disappears, but having the NPCs there is better than nothing. I also went the extra mile to enable sitting on benches. A bit of an unnecessary feature perhaps, but being able to interact with these benches and sit next to the townspeople is very satisfying to me. Nearby the campsite is also the first special NPC, a bag seller. Okay, so the final feature I want to talk about today is biomes and flowers. I really enjoy collecting flowers in other games, especially when you can breed them different colours. So for my game, I was thinking maybe different kinds of plants, such as flowers, could be collected from different biomes. More specifically, tropical houseplants could be found in a rainforest, flowers in a meadow, and succulents in a desert. So I began adding new foliage for the meadow biome, and this is how it turned out. I loved the idea of multiple biomes, but I still hated the way they were connected by loading zones. So a few months later, I rewrote all the procedural generation into a more open world style layout, complete with a chunk loading system. I'd like to save the details for a future devlog though, because there is a lot to unpack there. So this video only covers up to month 7 of development so far, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Making a game certainly doesn't happen overnight, and sometimes iterating on features feels like running in circles. But it's come a long way since the beginning, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here. I've actually put up a Steam page, so if you're interested, please consider wishlisting. There's many features and ideas that I haven't even scratched the surface of yet, so hopefully I can share them with you next time. Until then, thanks for watching.